No, at this moment there are no questions.
No questions at the moment. So then we continue with the second part of the lecture, which is about the question, what can we experience of the processes of waking and sleeping? Since we cannot study the inner invisible realms of consciousness by direct observation, the next best approach is to first examine the states of consciousness that we do have some knowledge of, based on our own experiences of the processes of waking and sleeping. Let's have a look at the various states. First, of course, we have the waking states during the daytime. In the East, referred to as the Jagrat state, from the verb jagri, to be awake. This is our normal state of consciousness as a human being when we are not asleep. Thus, this state corresponds to being conscious on the material plane. Then we have the dream state, referred to in the East as the Swapna state, from the root swap, that means dreams. This is the state of consciousness of a person when he is asleep and to some extent has become detached from his body and partially awakened in the lower mental realms. Then we have the state of dreamless sleep, referred to in the East as the Sushupti state, and it means fine or good sleep. This is a state which, for the average person, means that he is sunk in his consciousness in the higher mental plane, but which is experienced by the relatively weak brain-mind as a state of self-forgetfulness. Because of our limited practice, we have little or no memory of this. In addition, in the East there is also spoken of a fourth state called the Turya state, which is almost a nirvanic state, so referring to nirvana, and in fact relates to being consciously active at the spiritual plane. We will not discuss that further today. How can you experience this yourself, and how can we get some help from the Theosophia? Let's first have a look at the waking stage, Jagrat. During the day, as human beings, we are aware of our body on the material plane and active with our thinking and feelings on the mental plane. This will be of a personal character in many situations, and then we are active as a personal man on the lower mental plane. But we can also be active as a superpersonal man in many situations through a superpersonal attitude, if we are steadfast in trying to achieve, for instance, our super-personal ideals. Then we are active on a higher mental plane. An example. If we think again for a moment about the example of the mathematician. For a man it is possible to withdraw his consciousness from the material plane and cease to be consciously active there and still exist and be active on the mental plane. So we can conclude that it is possible for the often still personal human being to maintain a full mental consciousness without being aware of one's physicality. Then falling asleep. Just before falling asleep, we are aware of our thoughts of the past day, which we, if we follow the advice of Pythagoras, review and evaluate. We look back on the past day, and sometimes we can still get from our higher thinking a clear overview and insight of what essentially took place during that day. We are less and less aware of our body until in the blink of an eye we lose wakefulness and fall asleep. Then let's have a look at the dream sleep state. What the effect of sleep and dreaming is has been a subject of extensive research around the world in recent decades. One of the most famous studies in that that is by the neurologist Robert Stickgold in the United States. He conducted research on the effect of sleep on the learning behavior of students. One of his most famous studies involves having the subjects under study, most of the time students, play the so-called Tetris computer game, letting drop objects into a hole digitally. By waking large groups of students at different times of the night after playing this game and asking them what they could remember about their dream sleep, he was able to build up a very coherent picture of what exactly happened at different stages of sleep. First, there was the phase about dreaming about the computer game, the Swapna state. Especially in the first minutes after falling asleep and starting to dream, the following occurred. A constant repetition and letting go of thoughts and situation related to the computer game. Then followed a process of separating useful ideas, establishing relationships and gaining insight into other solutions to the game. Then a transition to a deep dreamless sleep, also called the REM sleep because of the rapid eye movement, the Sushupti state. Evidently at this stage, the dreaming, acquired insights is absorbed, assimilated into the memory of the brain to be used afterwards. It turned out that an essential element for learning the game well was to always get a good night of sleep, because especially then the performance became better and better. In any case, one of the things we can say about our dreams is that they give us clues that there are other forms of existence beyond our waking state in which our consciousness is experiencing things. Stickgold's research fits well with the phrase, "I need to sleep on that." And if that is a good night of sleep, then according to Stickgold, that is very important for your advancing insights. But we all know those nights with restless and chaotic dreamscapes, where we sleep lightly, so to speak, and we are easily woken up by noises around us. When we wake up, we are not refreshed, but sometimes even more tired than when we got into bed. The findings of Stickgold also confirm the thoughts in the Theosophica on sleep and dreaming. During dream sleep, an automatic repetition of what took place during the previous day or days. There is a distinction between the lower and the higher insightful thoughts. The higher thoughts are, as it were, extracted from the whole, and think of thoughts that have you have discovered for yourself as golden ideas, as truth that you can do a great deal with in practice. After this Sushupti, we fall in a deep, dreamless sleep. Everyone is familiar with that nocturnal experience where afterwards you have little or no recollection of a dream, but where at some point there was the awareness, this is just a dream. It indicates that while part of our consciousness plays an active role in the dream, another part seems to stand aside as a spectator and watches the events. Usually we are also unable to properly recall what we vaguely remember when we wake up and thus cannot retain it. All this is an important indication that there is more than one center of consciousness, often called the ego, within us. The Theosophical therefore teaches us that besides the lower mental realm, or that of the personal ego, there is also a higher mental realm, that of the reincarnating ego. There are other and higher realms above the mental plane, and we have referred to that already as the spiritual plane. And just as the ray of consciousness can withdraw from the material realm and still be active on the lower mental realm, so it can also withdraw from the lower mental plane and become active in the higher mental plane. What takes place during sleep, what takes place during deep, dreamless sleep, is that the ray of consciousness is raised to the higher mental plane, the realm of higher thinking. This is a plane at which the personal man cannot be conscious and active because it is still limited too much to the lower thinking. Hence, in our waking state, we can usually remember little or nothing of this plane because the experiences of our consciousness are not stored as memories in our brain. On the higher mental plane, the higher man, the reincarnating ego, can be conscious and active though. When the reincarnating ego is the active center of consciousness, the higher thoughts, drawn as lessons from daily activities, are incorporated, woven in, assimilated into the characteristics of this thinking. In fact, therefore, there is no new experience during the period of dreamless sleep, but it is in fact the internalization of the lessons and insights learned in the past day. In this sense, the title of this lecture could also have been The Internalization Processes During Sleep and Death. The dreamless sleep is followed by a transitional phase in which those lessons learned are unfolded, as it were, as advanced insights. Then follows a second dream sleep that takes place before waking. If we had a night of deep, refreshing sleep, it is often the case that we still vaguely have a dream experience. And every minute after waking, those memories become distorted and disjointed. We are still in a so-called state of sleep. Moreover, when we wake up, we can sometimes have the impression of a special atmosphere for a moment. We feel a little lifted above the everyday, just like when we listen to beautiful music. But usually that feeling quickly slips through our fingers and we cannot hold on to it. After such a seemingly dreamless night, it can happen that later that day, or even a few days later, when we are awake, suddenly flashes into our minds the memory of something from a dream, of which we were not aware until that moment, but which we are now aware of, but only now comes back to us very clearly. The Theosophia says that at the end of deep sleep, when the ray has been withdrawn to the level of the reincarnating ego, the activities of that reincarnating ego will give a certain imprint, as it were, on the physical brain and just bring about a dream experience there. Thereby a kind of spiritual impression can be transmitted to this personal ego, which has to do with the clear consciousness of this reincarnating ego. Finally, you wake up as a personal human being, normal thinking sets in, and you remember the last thoughts of the day before and look ahead. What will this day bring? In discussing these different states of consciousness, we looked at our own experiences and at some scientific insights. And we looked at the thoughts from the Theosophia. But where does the latter knowledge come from? The answer to that question is because there have been people who have had first-hand experience in those other invisible realms of existence, and who have studied the processes of sleep and death. How is that possible? This is possible if we realize that a human being is a ray of consciousness containing several centers of consciousness that can be alternately the active center of consciousness. There are humans, one step further developed than we are, who have permanently localized their consciousness in the reincarnating ego. That part of our composite constitution, which is imperishable and remains active during sleep and death of the body. We are talking about the so-called masters of wisdom and compassion, because they do not lose consciousness during sleep and death. They have been able to study those processes and impart knowledge about them to us humans who are not yet so advanced. There are also references to the processes of sleep and death in the great books of the world. The ancient Greeks called sleep hypnos and death thanatos twin brothers. Sleep is imperfect death, death is a perfect sleep. In other words, there is an analogy between the processes of sleep and the processes of death. This gives us the opportunity, by being attentive to everything concerning sleep, to gain more insight into the truth about what is said about the processes concerning death through analogy. Before we start talking about the processes of death and reincarnation, it is good to emphasize that consciousness, ultimately, is always the leading factor relative to the outer processes of change that we can observe. Clear examples can be found that the dying process starts from within. If we disregard premature death due to karmic causes in the past, then, as we grow older, especially in people with lofty ideals, we see that consciousness unfolds more and more. Indeed, the higher parts of man become more and more attracted to spiritual worlds. A separation then takes place in the inner parts of the constitution until sometime before death. There may even be an overshadowing of the personal man by the reincarnating ego. For those people, you can notice the older, the wiser. An example is the writer Tolstoy, whose last writings, according to H.P. Blavatsky, contain the most excellent wisdom. So, to sum it up, your own observations, scientific research, like the research by Stickgold, and the teachings of the Theosophical indicate that different states of consciousness can be distinguished during the waking and sleeping state. We will have a 3-minute break now, and we will come back to you, and please send your questions to the email address or the chat, and we will see you later. Welcome back. I think we have some questions, Astrid.
Yes, we have a number of questions. The first question is, how can cooperation start between the reincarnating ego and the personal part?
Yeah, very good question. Actually, if we train ourselves to be more focused on the more superpersonal type of thoughts during our waking state, then we train ourselves to become, let's say, a channel for as a personal ego, personal man, to become sensitive, as it were, for the insights and the influences and inspirations from the reincarnating ego. So if we train ourselves to become more or less of the same quality of the reincarnating ego, because the reincarnating ego is actually defined by the fact that the thoughts are of a higher mental nature, so superpersonal thoughts. So if we train ourselves during the waking state, then we will become very sensitive to receive those thoughts from our reincarnating ego. So we will make ourselves into a channel to receive those thoughts and influences. So this is how we can build up this relationship with our higher part, our reincarnating ego, and that we can work on that consciously during the daytime.
Okay. The second question is, somehow our thoughts during sleep become better ordered. Is one of the causes perhaps that we, during the first phases of sleep, get rid of our more emotional and lower mental disturbing noisy thoughts, so that the more clear understandings remain?
Yes, I think this is really a factor that counts. Or you can easily imagine that this must be of importance. During our waking state, there are so many distractions we have all around us, so much information that we focus our attention on. And of course, when you fall asleep, we do have this, let's say, automatic process of recurring thoughts that are related to what we were thinking during the daytime, of our experiences and adventures during the daytime. But nevertheless, it is true that part of these influences are falling away. So it is more limited, and in that way you can understand that it is more easy to do this separation process, let this separation process take place, without other turbulences and disturbances around it, especially if you go to the process of, let's say, first fall asleep and have a dream sleep where all these thoughts are coming back. But when you go to a deeper sleeping state, a dreamless state of sleep, then you are coming in touch with your higher nature, with the reincarnating ego. And when you go back then again in this dream, you go back to the other phase of dream sleep. In between, this separation process has taken place, and you will experience the influences of that, because you will go from, let's say, a more personal, focused sleep state to a above super personal sleep state, and in between these states this separation process takes place.
Okay. There are plenty of people who can hardly sleep or sleep very poorly, so they can hardly work things out on those inner areas at night.
Yeah.
What does that mean for the consciousness?
Well, the consciousness is actually not benefiting on a regular basis in two ways, actually. During the sleep phase and during the different states of sleep during the night, you have this process of separation of useful thoughts to improve your insight, which is not really taking place so much. But also during the daytime, probably you won't feel yourself that fit as when you have really slept a good night of sleep. So you will also be hampered in your concentration probably during certain hours of the day, because you feel that you didn't sleep well. So also during the day you will have at least a few hours that you have not the concentration you could have if you have slept well. So it hampers you in two ways: during the sleep, because you don't benefit as much as you could, and also during the daytime you will find the consequences of that because you didn't sleep well. And everybody knows this, of course, when he had too short sleep or couldn't sleep because of the heat or other reasons, that you don't catch the sleep and that you suffer from insomnia, as they call it in English.
But it almost sounds like that what happens during the day will also affect the sleep again at night. So
Yeah.
it's like a spiral.
Yeah, yeah. You could come into a spiral where, well, in the end, also your physical health may deteriorate from this, because the body also needs sleep. Your senses need to rest because they need to recuperate. So hopefully people can try to do something to get...
How to get out?
Yes, to get out of this circle.
Yeah. There's another question in the chat. It says, can we classify daydreaming and deep meditation under Swapna and Sushupti in the scheme of the various states of consciousness?
Well, it's a very good question. Daydreaming, I think I would say that it could be a kind of Swapna state where you let yourself go with the thoughts of your imagination or fantasy or whatever it is, or your ideals that you have. So that could be Swapna type of state of consciousness, but also there it can also, if you have the right type of mental state and can lift it up to, say, let's say, a higher state of daydreaming, it could also become a Sushupti type of state of consciousness, where you gain insights that you didn't have before. So it also there you can go to a higher state, and the same is the case for meditation. It is if you assume meditation as a kind of increased state of concentration, and that is what we usually do when we speak in Theosophy about meditation, to focus our concentration on a certain question or issue. Then it can be that if you focus your attention completely on it and you are able to let all the disturbances and distractions fall away, then you can also raise your consciousness to a Sushupti level where you can gain insight during that meditation.
But then perhaps depending on the topic of what you're focusing on.
Yes, yes, certainly.
Okay.
So it is possible, it is not only during your sleep when you go obviously through a Sushupti state, but also during the daytime you can learn to elevate yourself to this higher state. And in fact, this refers to the first question of this round of questions, where it was asked, what is the relation between the reincarnating ego and the personal ego? And that is exactly this. If you train yourself during the waking state to be clear of, to be very clear in your mind, and try to exercise yourself, to bring yourself into a state of clearness of thinking, especially if it is about higher thoughts, superpersonal thoughts, then you reach, every time you can tip on this Sushupti state of consciousness, which is also the same as the one of the reincarnating ego. So you are raising yourself to that level.
And what about if you lose consciousness, like in an accident, or is that a?
Well, there are
state?
many moments where we in fact lose consciousness. If we fall asleep, if we go to bed, then there is a certain part of that falling asleep where you are not conscious. It is you don't recall, you don't experience anything. So we do have these phases, transition phases from one situation to another, and I've indicated that in my diagrams, that there is always a transition phase between waking state, dream state, and there you are without any experience or any consciousness. And also that is part of the whole process of going from one state to the other.
Yeah, that was it for now.
That were the questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your sharp questions, because it really are very good questions. We move on.